Alexander the Great really needs no introduction. He's mentioned frequently in popular culture and is championed as perhaps the greatest conqueror in the ancient world. Thanks to Alexander, we got to learn a little more about the rest of the world through his expeditions, and as a history lover, that has value. Ironically, however, just like he ignored marching on the overwhelming majority of the African continent, we too have totally ignored what was going on in Africa during the time of Alexander the Great. Hopefully today, I can help change all that. What up, African world? It's Home Team here, and welcome back to another video of African history, culture, and worldview. By supporting this channel on Patreon, you're helping in the creation of these videos and supporting this content. If you'd like access to full courses and sources, or you simply want to show your support, you may do so by clicking the Patreon link in the description box below. Alexander was a Macedonian ruler of Greece who founded one of the largest empires in the ancient world, as he reigned from 336 BC to 323 BC. But before we get into any actual historical events in Africa during his reign, I thought it would be interesting to mention the relationship Greece had with the peoples south of Egypt, or what we would call the Nubians or Kushites today. Greek scholars frequently mentioned Nubian people in their literature, calling them Ethiopians. Apparently, like the Egyptians, the Greeks were also aware of Kushite or so-called Ethiopian military might. When Alexander conquered Egypt, it would seem as though he could have easily kept going south in an attempt to take Nubia. The reasons he didn't seems to be a curiosity even amongst the Greeks, as one Greek account known as the Alexander Romance constructed a sort of mythology as to why. According to the Alexander Romance, Alexander desired to take Kush and decided he would march on these ancient lands he heard so much about as a child via his studies with Aristotle. According to the account, in 332 BC, the queen at the time, known to the Greeks as the Candace of Meroe, strategically arranged her army in preparation for Alexander's arrival. She met the young Alexander on the battlefield on her war elephant, which greatly intimidated the Greeks. After he assessed the situation and the strength of her army, Alexander wisely decided to withdraw and head back into Egypt. Even though the story is clearly fictional, it still has tremendous value for us in the diaspora today, because throughout the oral and written literature of the African and Mediterranean world, we frequently hear about the military might of Kush, especially the skill of their archers. The Persians were well aware of that and even employed Kushite mercenaries in battle. Now, the first historical event we'll be discussing during the time of Alexander naturally comes out of Nubia. While Alexander was on the throne, the Kushite king Nastasia was ruling in Kush around 335 BC. Nastasia is not a very well-known ruler because his exploits are overshadowed by the Kushite dynasty that conquered Egypt and created an empire popularly known as the 25th dynasty of Egypt. King Nastasia is said to have been the ruler that moved the Kushite capital from Napata to Meroe. One interesting event under his reign was an invasion by a ruler he calls Cambasutin. Now, some scholars have suggested that the name Cambasutin is the Kushite variant of the name Cambyses. Nastasia tells us that Cambasutin's march on Kush was crushed. Nastasia sent out his bowmen against him and routed his enemy, defeating him, capturing his arms, boats, cattle, and laying waste to his lands. The Stele of Nastasia gives a full account of this. Even though some theorize that this might have been the Persian ruler Cambyses, it's unlikely given the time frame, as the Persian ruler's failure to take Kush was around 200 years earlier. But it is interesting that the names sound very similar. The next historical event in Africa during the time of Alexander was the ironworking abilities of West Africans, specifically within Nigeria's most recognizable ancient culture, the Nok culture. Aside from the beautiful Nok sculptures that were flourishing during this time, a number of iron smelting furnaces excavated in the Nok region were discovered around the 4th century BC. One site in the Nok region yielded 10 furnaces alone, hinting to how common iron smelting was. Also in West Africa, the ancient settlement of Dar Tichet in Mauritania was in its final stages of decline. The evidence tells us that the stone settlements of Dartichit were built by the Soninka people. This settlement, or perhaps kingdom, was a precursor to what later became the Wagaru Empire, also known as the Ghana Empire. In its prime, Dartichit featured around 540 stone-walled compounds with clear street layouts. Some had massive surrounding walls and were fortified. This is a pretty clear indication of urban development in ancient West Africa. The oral history of the Soninka people, collected in a series of oral literature called the Dausi, gives us some insight as to why Dartichit may have fallen. In the Dausi, there's a story called Gasir's Lute, the legend of a young Soninka prince. This story frequently refers to the various city-states of the Soninka people that rose and fell over time, similar to the city-states of ancient Greece. It tells us about the many battles of Gasir against the Tuareg and possibly other Berber groups that may have led to the fall of some of these cities. And during the time of Alexander, one of these cities, possibly what we refer to as Dartichit, began to decline after its beginnings in around 1900 BC. One scholar named Patrick Monsoon believes this Soninka stone settlement collapsed as a result of environmental reasons and that Berber incursions simply aided. In Central Africa during the time of Alexander, the existence of a highly civilized African people is often ignored, largely because their civilization was not only destroyed but absorbed into the framework of the Zagawa and Kanembu peoples of the Central Sahara. When speaking about the civilizations of Central Africa, we often speak about Kanem, but forget about the Sao Civilization, which was an impressive civilization we know very little about. During the life of Alexander, the Sao Civilization was probably in their prime. The Sao people lived in the regions of Cameroon and Chad today. The Sao left very clear indications of their presence. Their civilization was so impressive that initially some believed that Central Africans could not have done this. And so, individuals began to advance the idea that the Sao people were a direct descendant of the Hyksos who invaded Egypt and moved further south after being expelled. But, of course, today, due to genuine scholarship, we know that the Sao people were an indigenous African people who began building fortified cities. The Sao people were known for their trans-Saharan trading activities, apparently specializing in elephant hunting, which is a small indication of a flourishing civilization. The Sao developed sculptures, coins, statues, and other artworks using iron, bronze, and copper. The historian Caroline Ifeka provides the following description of the Sao peoples. The Sao people possessed considerable political and artistic genius. They developed city-states which were the centers of local patriotism. Each city was surrounded by strong defensive walls and dominated the life of the surrounding countryside, which it both protected and governed. Government was by an elaborate hierarchy headed by a divine ruler. Except on ceremonial occasions, the rulers made few public appearances and even then remained concealed from the common gaze by a screen. Women occupied a respected position in society, and the queen mother and senior sister of the ruler exercised considerable political influence on the government of the state. The Sao people were mainly settled farmers, but among them were craftsmen of considerable industrial and artistic merit. They were able to work in both clay and metals to manufacture household utensils, tools, and works of art for religious purposes. Impressive objects found by archaeologists include burial urns and figures of animals and human beings, both in clay and bronze. Well, I'm all out, guys. I'm hoping you learned a little about what was going on in Africa during the reign of Alexander. If you like these videos and want to help in its continued production, consider supporting the home team on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below. Know thyself, remember your ancestors. Peace.